Hello and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 5 Countdown video. Today our analysts will be listing the top 5 compositions for patch 11.4. The latest patch has changed the meta quite significantly, so let's have a quick moment of silence for reroll compositions. And now that reroll builds are far less common, we've moved back into a meta that favors flexible play. It's also worth keeping in mind that the meta is still being figured out, as there were some delays to when 11.4 went live. With that said, let's go ahead and get started with our top 5 list. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Kicking off our top 5 list, we have Mages coming in as the number 5 composition. As mentioned in the intro, the current builds being played tend to be flexible. That means when we're talking about mages, we're actually talking about multiple variations, with the main focus going to be on mages as the primary carries. Dragonsoul is the top dog when it comes to mages, but Veigar and even Brand are viable options depending on the situation. The two main variations you're going to see mages being played in are Elderwoods and 7 mages. Elderwood Mage is pretty much the same as previous iterations, as you're going to want 6 Elderwood with Aurelion Soul as the primary carry. Veigar is definitely playable as the carry, but he does need to be 3-starred to have any chance at placing in the top 4. Aurelion is more reliable as a carry, but the issue with Aurelion is that he's contested by Dragonsoul compositions. For the typical mage build, 7 mages, you can play it in a whole bunch of different ways. Rerolling for Twisted Fate or Brand is one way to play, but not the most common. Generally, the goal is to get to level 7 and have either Veigar or Aurelion as your main carry. Annie serves as the frontliner plus any Vanguard with CC like Sejuani. This variation is a bit of a glass cannon, so players often roll to find Annie 3 and sometimes Lulu 3. Those two champions can help shore up the defensive issues of the build. All in all, the current patch is less about forcing a particular composition and going with what the game gives you, and mages work well in those conditions. Fabled, which is also known as Vanguard Mystic Fabled, was a mid-tier build at best during the last meta. With so many champions and synergies getting hit by the nerf bat in 11.4, we're seeing Fabled rise up in the meta. Overall, the composition is rather simple to follow. The goal is to have 4 Vanguard, 4 Mystic, and 3 Fabled. This can be done in a few ways with various champions, but the core 2 champions to always have are Nico and Nautilus. Nico serves as the primary damage dealer, while Nautilus is amazing at stalling out fights. Generally, you'll want to hit both Nico 3 and Nautilus 3, as that's the primary win condition for the build. So what makes Fabled a good composition in the current meta? Mainly, the pace of the game has slowed down now that reroll compositions are less common. Most players are aiming to roll at level 7 and 8, so Fabled is much easier to hit the necessary champions before other players hit their power spikes. Since Vanguard and Mystic are inherently defensive traits, it means fights will take longer and thus more units will die. Due to that, it's easy for Fabled to finish in the top 4 because they'll lose health far slower than other compositions. Of course, it is possible to top 2 or even win games, but the general idea when playing Fabled is to play for a consistent top 4. One last thing about Vanguard Mystic Fabled is that you do have a bit of flexibility towards countering the lobby you're in. 6 Vanguards is great against physical damage compositions, and while 6 Mystic is a bit harder to pivot into, it does counter heavy magic damage lobbies. Alright, let's move into a familiar composition which comes in at number 3, Kayle Executioner. Unsurprisingly, Kayle is still a top tier composition in the meta, especially since it was relatively untouched by nerfs. Sure, Kayle 2 lost a bit of damage and Divine has some adjustments, but overall, it's still the same as before. The main reason as to why Kayle isn't the second or first place spot of our top 5 is due to the lack of variance the composition has. By that, we don't mean what champions and traits you play with Kayle, because that is relatively flexible. Divine is commonly used, and you will want Executioner, but traits aside, the lack of flexibility for Kayle is, well, because of Kayle. To play the build, you need to hit Kayle, and you need to 2-star her. Plus, Kayle has specific item requirements to do well, like having an RFC and Rageblade. For those reasons, it makes playing Kayle somewhat hard to do when the rest of the meta is fairly flexible. Another reason is that Kayle will be contested. In every lobby, it's likely that there's 2 or 3 players that will be fighting over Kayle, which weakens how strong it ends up being. Sure, some games, one player will high roll and get Kayle 2 before others, but oftentimes what ends up happening is 2 or 3 players hold hands and place either below the top 4 or at best 3rd. Yes, Kayle is strong. Yes, a Kayle composition can win games. But make sure you scout frequently in your games, as playing Kayle is a bit of a coin toss right now, since hitting Kayle 2 can be quite difficult. Up next, we have Slayer coming in as the number 2 composition. The complete opposite of Kale is a build like Slayer, where you can play several different carries. Any of Zed, Olaf, Samira, and even Tryndamere are playable as carries in a Slayer-focused composition. And the composition itself is flexible, as you really only need 3 Slayers as a baseline. The final board that you end up with is going to vary game to game, as each carry needs different traits to do well. Zed, for example, is great with Spirit and Ninja. Olaf does well with Siphoner and Dragonsoul, while Samira can be tossed into practically any board as long as you have decent items for her. Tryndamere is trickier to use as he's more item dependent than anything, but both Warlord and Duelist are useful for him. The overall flexibility of Slayer units is what elevates it so highly in the meta. The main downside to Slayers is that each carry is dependent on items to do well. Zed needs bows to help him scale during a fight, while both Olaf and Samira need Deathblade. Tryndamere is still being figured out, but Hand of Justice and defensive items are good at boosting his survivability in a fight. As the meta does favor flexible play, most of the time you're not going to be forcing any particular style of Slayer. If you happen to hit a chosen Zed, that opens the door to playing him as the carry. Maybe you weren't planning on Tryndamere as your carry, but you found a chosen Tryndamere after leveling to 8. Basically, be flexible. Don't tunnel vision in on only Olaf or only Samira, even though those two are considered the best Slayer carries. Now we can talk about the composition coming in at number 1, Dragonsoul. Dragonsoul is a lot like Slayer in that the main carry is really flexible. Primarily, you're going to see Olaf and Aurelion in that role, but Swain, Shyvana, and even Tristana can do well enough. The reason so many champions can carry in the Dragonsoul build is that, in general, no one champion is doing all of the damage. Thanks to the buff Dragonsoul provides, you can have multiple champions capable of doing good amounts of damage. Heck, even Braum can do a decent amount of damage if he survives long enough with the buff. Basically, the Dragonsoul attack that triggers every 5 seconds will do a lot of damage to most champions. And that damage scales throughout the game, so you're able to run a trait during stage 2 until the end of the game if you choose to. Now, as far as the composition itself goes, the main goal here is to run 6 Dragonsoul. Again, this can be done in multiple ways, but generally you want one of Olaf, Aurelion, and Swain, as all 3 of those are the best units for Dragonsoul. After that, you can fill the board with whatever you need, whether that's Slayer for Olaf or Mage for Aurelion. Also, keep in mind that you don't always have to play 6 Dragonsoul. You can instead play 3 and flex into a bunch of other champions and traits. Overall, what makes Dragonsoul the best composition in the current meta is how flexible they are. There's no exact composition you need to run, nor does it require specific items. All you need to do is find a carry, toss a bunch of other champions in, and call it a day. This can be done during the mid-game, late game, or even early on as the Dragonsoul trait scales extremely well. Alright, that's going to be it for our top 5 compositions for patch 11.4. But of course, we're not done quite yet, as we have a few honorable mentions to talk about. These are a few viable compositions in the current meta, but struggle with consistency. Up first for our honorable mentions is Duelist. Duelist got hit pretty hard by the nerf bat with the trait, Fiora, and Yasuo all receiving adjustments. In particular, the nerf to Yasuo hurt the overall consistency of the composition, as his value during the early and mid game was important for Duelist to scale into the late game. It's still viable to reroll for Yasuo 3, but to do so, you need a lot of early game luck. Basically, if you're not hitting multiple Yasuos before Krugs, you may need to consider either pivoting into a different build or trying to roll for a better mid-game carry like Kalista. That is one way you can still play Duelist, by pivoting into it during the mid-game with Kalista or Tryndamere as the carry. The style of play isn't foolproof because Duelists need to go ahead in the mid-game to do well, but if you luck out and hit a quick 2-star Kalista or Tryndamere on level 7, you can still scale into the late game with the comp. Overall, you can still play Duelists even as reroll composition, just keep in mind that there's a lot more risk to it. Another reroll composition that fell off thanks to nerfs is Warlords. Specifically, we're talking about Nidalee, as Nidalee, well, she's really weak now. Sure, you can still use her during stage 2, but Nidalee 3 is no longer viable, and as a main carry, she just doesn't cut it anymore. Katarina, on the other hand, is still a viable option. While the trait and Katarina 3 did take substantial nerfs, if you hit it quick enough, the build can still top 4. But overall, consider Warlords more of a mid-game composition that you can pivot from, and less of a build that you try to play into the late game. And the last honorable mention we have for today is Cultists. Cultists have not been doing well for quite some time. Mostly you'd use them in the early game if you hit a chosen cultist, and they do alright mid-game, but for the most part you'd never see anyone do well with them. But in patch 11.4, with practically everything being nerfed, cultists are a viable option again. Now, by viable, we don't necessarily mean they're a late game comp. Cultists still primarily do the best in the mid-game, much like Warlords. Hitting an early 6 cultist power spike should put you on a fast track to win streaking and help you hit level 8 in a much better position than other players. From there, you can pivot into whatever composition you hit. Of course, there is the option to play late game Cultist, especially with the 9 Cultist Galio receiving a buff, but it's not the most reliable way to play as Cultists still lack a proper carry. Both Sivir and Kalista can serve well as the primary carry, but neither of them scale well into the late game, especially since other Cultists really don't synergize with their other traits. If you have a good mid game and can hit 9 Cultists during stage 5, you can usually skate by until level 9 and possibly finish in the top 2. But in general, when running Cultists, your main goal is to have a good mid game and transition out of them later. That's all for today, folks. While the diversity of the meta has fallen off due to a lot of compositions no longer being viable, we're still in a much healthier place than everyone just pressing D. Let us know in the comment section below what compositions you've been climbing with, if there's any we missed in our top 5. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.